Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Kaffeepause. Today's a sort of unique Kaffeepause because I'm actually joining you from an office in the Bundestag in Berlin. And under other circumstances, I actually would have liked to have sat down together with our guest today, Anna Sauerbrey, and do sort of a live stream from a common location. But I am tied up in meetings with our Young Leaders Conference, and so that wasn't possible. But at least this way, Anna and I can connect. Anna is the foreign editor at the weekly Die ZEIT, and previously she headed the opinion pages of Der Tagesspiegel and Tagesspiegel Causa, the paper's online magazine. Anna, it is always great to see you, and I just want to welcome you back to the Kaffeepause. Herzlich willkommen.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I often begin the Kaffeepause discussion by asking guests to tell us something about the Stimmung, the political mood in Berlin. But I think that today there's another really good way of sort of measuring the pulse and thinking about what people are thinking about and talking about here in political Berlin. On Friday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was grilled by journalists for about 90 minutes at the annual press conference just before the summer recess. And so I thought we could maybe start with that. The Chancellor was asked questions about a range of issues at Friday's press conference. What were some of your main takeaways in terms of topics and themes that were addressed during that exchange?
Well, yes, it's an old German ritual that the chancellor, or also the female chancellor, has a press conference before the recess, and it's usually, as you've said, a very wide-ranging conversation, especially because other than usual, more of the foreign correspondents in Berlin attend this press conference and ask questions from their respective perspectives in their home countries. So it's also usually a bit, a bit more relaxed than the usual press conference we have weekly with representatives of the government there. I think this year had like three major topics. The first was, of course, the state of the coalition, which headed into the recess without having their key or most important and most contested bill through the Bundestag. It's a bill on the heating bill. It's called the heating bill, which is really a major piece of legislation that is supposed to bring Germany forward on the path to carbon neutrality. And it was stopped by the Supreme Court just for formal reasons, really not for any reasons of content, but just before the summer break. So they will have to bring that back. And of course, given all the fighting over this bill within the coalition, this was a very frustrating moment. And of course, he was asked about that. And the second big domestic topic was the strength of the far-right AfD we see in the polls right now in Germany. And thirdly, I would say it was foreign policy, a few questions relating to the NATO summit that had just closed, that Scholz, of course, attended with major topics like Sweden's accession to NATO and Ukraine's possible future accession to NATO. And I think overall, the mood he tried to convey was do not panic. Everything is all right. Nothing's as bad as it seems. So I think that was his major message to the viewers, to the journalists, whether you buy it or not.
So this don't panic mode, I'm sure that had to do both with domestic politics and with foreign policy, right?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how he sort of made that case, particularly since, as you alluded to, this important heating legislation, which is sort of a flagship for this government, has now been held up because of the Supreme Court, as you said. I had an opportunity to speak with several Bundestag members earlier today. One from the opposition said that she was very disappointed with how this government has handled some of the legislation, and mentioned this one as an example, that the draft laws are produced and the Bundestag members who have to vote on it don't have enough time to adequately review it. A Free Democrat Bundestag member who was part of the same conversation said that he was quite confident that this was just a slight delay and that the law would be passed in September, shortly after the summer break. So how did the Chancellor sort of grapple with that?
I think he tried to be optimistic about the coalition's future. He was asked by one, I believe, a foreign journalist, how he would sum up or what he would like to be remembered for as a chancellor. And he said, well, this is only 2 years into my very long tenure as Chancellor of Germany. I'm not ready to sum it up yet. And I think he expects to govern with this coalition to the very end of this term, and of course hopes to get another term, maybe with this coalition or another. But it was very contested in this coalition. I do think they will pass it after the summer break. As you said, it's just for technical reasons that it was delayed. At the same time, it was a major defeat, and it only entered the Bundestag now because it took the coalition so long to find a compromise. And I think he had some. He did say that we need to, or the coalition needs to be more capable of finding compromise sooner. He did not name any of his coalition partners, but it was clearly a message directed to both the Green Party and the Liberals to be more compromising, to understand that this is a three-party coalition that really needs also painful compromises, and that you can't just cater to your own electorate, but that you need to look at Germany as a whole. So I think that was one message. And then maybe something you can, he also said that the next time they put forward a major bill, they will work very diligently before putting it on the cabinet table, which was maybe a small reprimand to Minister of the Economy, Robert Habeck, whose first draft just wasn't ready, as many commentators said, which has also contributed to why it took so long to pass it, or to at least deliver it to the Bundestag.
So, Anna, during the course of our conversation, I'd certainly like to come back to domestic politics and sort of your sense of the state of the coalition. But before we do that, let's maybe pick up on a couple of the big foreign policy news items of the last week. You mentioned it yourself. The NATO summit in Vilnius was part and parcel of the press conference that the Chancellor held. You actually accompanied the Chancellor to Vilnius to cover the NATO summit. Can you share with us what some of your takeaways were from that summit, and sort of the Chancellor's positioning on that?
I think it was a summit that was certainly disappointing to Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelensky has voiced that disappointment very frankly in a tweet just even before the summit had concluded and the conclusions and the communique were public. He then pretty much took it all back. I have attended the press conference he had with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, where he really was rather not apologetic, but he very much lauded the communique. He was very appreciative of the different measures. And I think this was very well received. And from what we heard from diplomats, the atmosphere behind the scenes between Germany and and Ukraine, also in the newly founded Ukraine-NATO Council, supposed to be very friendly, and even the dinner on the very night after he tweeted out is said to have been very friendly. We don't know, of course, we haven't been there, and if I were a diplomat, I would say too that it was very friendly, but it probably was. Germany was on the skeptic side alongside with the United States when it came to Ukraine's NATO accession. What we heard from diplomats, why it lacks any concrete timetable, is that, well, we don't know how this war is going to end. We don't know what the conditions will be that will lead to a ceasefire eventually. So from a German point of view, or German diplomats' point of view, it doesn't make any sense to lay out concrete steps towards NATO accession at this point in time. I think what Scholz really did work for was the G7 declaration, which he fell short of calling security guarantees in his summer press conference. He called it a security partnership. But I think even that is a step forward, because he's been using the term partner to refer to Ukraine quite frequently lately. So I think there is a new understanding of a very long-term relationship between Germany and Ukraine, and he's working in the different formats, particularly the G7, to foster that partnership.
As the foreign policy editor at Die ZEIT, I mean, I'm sure that you also are thinking a little bit about how the summit in Vilnius might have been watched from the Kremlin, and I'm wondering whether Zelensky is weakened as a result of the fact that he didn't get what he wanted, which was a clear path to NATO membership. It seems from everything that I saw that NATO is open to a path toward membership at some point when conditions have been met, but there's nothing tangible. There's not a timeline for that. I mean, obviously, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin was watching closely what was coming out of Vilnius. Do you have any thoughts on what the interpretation might be there?
Well, the summit certainly lacked a grand gesture. At the same time, I think there's a lot in the conclusions that will foster that partnership, or at least if the 31 NATO countries, or 32 now, really do take that seriously. I mean, the NATO-Ukraine Council could become a forum for closer coordination, also in the technical military field. It could become a forum to better coordinate the military aid that is going to Ukraine. Also just a platform for conversation for Ukraine to address its concerns, to say what it needs in this war. And I think it was also important that Ukraine will not have to have a membership action plan, which I think was a suggestion that came from Jens Stoltenberg and his team, to have that as a signal. So I mean, the Kremlin can also always, use this for its propaganda and say, well, they weren't invited. But I mean, they came as close to an invitation as is politically possible right now. And I think that was probably registered too. Yeah.
So the other big foreign policy news last week was that the German government released its China strategy. This comes on the heels of, I guess, about 4 weeks after the release of the national security strategy. And obviously a lot of people have been poring over that and trying to understand it. It's something that also came up during the press conference on Friday. Can you maybe share with us some of the questions that were raised about the China strategy at the press conference, and the ways in which the Chancellor responded to those questions?
Yeah, so, and I have to say, I'm sorry for the drilling sounds. We've just moved into a new building and it's not quite finished. So I just heard it. So it might come into the China strategy part. Yeah, I think after the national security strategy, everybody was waiting for something more tangible. And I think this China strategy really does contain a few more tangible points. I would say that it's the end of Germany's pure mercantilist view of China. It's also the end of naivete. It really does name some of the problems. It's very frank and outspoken, both in the criticism of China's international economic policy, its role in the Taiwan and Indo-China conflicts, Indo-Pacific conflicts, also its hybrid strategies in Europe. So these are all named very clearly, which is a new step, I think, to lay it out in a policy document like that. At the same time, I think when it comes to concrete measures, and that were some of the questions that came up in the press conference too, it leaves a lot of room for flexibility of how to really use the instruments that are in it. So it's concrete, but at the same time, it leaves some room to interpretation. And for example, when it comes to export controls and investment controls, there's always this. They left a lot of space for maneuver.
Yeah. So one of our viewers is curious about sort of this element of it that you were just talking about. She writes, how has the release of the China strategy been received in Germany? But sort of more important for the line of discussion that we were just having, does the China strategy bring the parties in the governing coalition together in their stance on China? Or is the perception still that the Chancellor and the Free Democrats are being more moderate, while Annalena Baerbock and the Greens are being more hawkish when it comes to China?
Yes, I think it was received quite well. I mean, of course, I don't know what about the broader population. There haven't been any surveys or polls asking people what they think about it. Many of Germany's China experts were actually quite content and said this is going into the right direction. It could be more concrete. We have to see how it's really made operative, but people very critical, that are traditionally very critical of Germany's China policies, like Thorsten Benner at GPPI or Janka Oertel, or the people at Merix, which is one of the major China think tanks here in Germany, which is under Chinese sanctions. So these are very critical people, and they mostly were content with what we've seen now in the paper. And the second part of the question was
well, sort of the differences between the FDP and the SPD and Scholz on the one side, and the more hawkish Greens on the other.
Yes, I mean, that's why it took them so long, because they had actually planned to publish it within their first year of governing, and now it's like well into the second year of governing that we actually see that we hear that there was a lot of forth and back, not just between the three parties, but also between the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry, with the Chancellery wanting some more room to maneuver, some more liberties for companies to pick their own strategies, and both the Foreign Office and the also Green Ministry of the Economy opting for stricter investment controls, for example. And we now sort of have it both in there. You can really go through it and say, okay, this is something the liberals wrote in it, like working conditions of, law firms in China, which is probably something the liberals put in there. And then we have the greener parts also referring to the feminist foreign policy. And I think when it comes to the concrete instruments like investment controls and export controls, we see a lot of compromise formula, which is probably what they could agree on in the end.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been hearing, certainly here in Berlin, is an emphasis on de-risking, certainly not decoupling, trying to diversify supply chains as a way of creating a more resilient German economy. One thing that I did sort of pick up on a little bit is that, and I don't know if this parallel is fair, but both Chancellor Merkel and then Chancellor Scholz talked about Nord Stream 2 as a commercial project and not one that had geopolitical implications. Of course, it did have and does have geopolitical implications. But I'm wondering, with the China strategy, obviously the government cannot tell the private sector what it can and cannot do. But do you think that there's more recognition now that relations with China are both commercial projects, but also have a geopolitical and a security component to them?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think so. I mean, they say they want to be more rigorous about both Chinese investments in Germany that could affect German security interests, and also German investments in China that could be used to gather know-how that could be used to speed up the dual use sector within China, or suck up know-how that could help the Chinese defense sector. And it explicitly says that these investments by German companies in China that could lead to such problems will be, I think the formulation is subject to rigorous scrutiny. So some of the investments by German companies in China might be, might be scrutinized much more consequently, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point.
So, sort of coming back to Europe, one of our viewers is curious if you might talk a little bit about the future of German leadership, if you will. The viewer writes, I wonder whether you might comment on how Germany sees itself in the current configuration of forces in Europe. France seems to be embroiled in domestic strife. Britain has sunk into relatively less relevance after Brexit. Italy is also not on the scene. Meanwhile, Chancellor Scholz has declared a Zeitenwende, and there are some who actually think it will amount to something. Angela Merkel was often reluctant to put Germany too much in the driver's seat in European politics. Do you think this will change under Chancellor Scholz?
That's a really good question. I actually don't think so. I mean, Angela Merkel was clearly seen as a leader within European politics. She did play a leading role in the financial and state finance crises. And when the moment came during the Corona pandemic, she actually, surprisingly to some, did take a major initiative leading to the Corona Fund that the EU set up, which was a major step towards common debt taken on by the European Union itself, which was something that her party long rejected, and she really surprised her party and everybody else in Europe pretty much with taking up that initiative with Macron, and it really came out of nowhere to many observers. And I mean, we don't know, maybe Scholz will come to that point too. Maybe he's just, waiting in the background for the very big moment where he can really move things forward. But he and the Chancellery, from my point of view, are certainly not working towards that. And he has now given two major speeches on European policies, one in Prague in his first year, and then recently in Brussels. And they were both rather general and didn't lay out any concrete policy proposals. I mean, one thing they keep saying, which they repeat in the China strategy, for example, is that we need to be, or Europe needs to be, more agile in its foreign and security policy, which means that the anonymity principle has to be lifted, and we have to have majority decisions in this policy field, which is, of course, something that's very far at the horizon. You can work towards it, but we probably won't have it within his term. And when you look at the China strategy, for example, it's sort of undecided on how European it wants to be too. It does mention we want to do everything in a European context, but it also has some very explicit caveats that, well, we might take people from European institutions on our trips if we like to, but I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But we are not committing to that, and that's what we saw last December when he went on his own. He did not take Ursula von der Leyen, and there was only minor coordination with the European Union ahead of his journey.
So let's come back to domestic politics a little bit. One of the other themes that came up during the press conference was migration and integration in Germany. This, of course, has been a big topic in recent weeks, and I'd even say recent months, particularly as people think about demographic trends and the need for skilled labor. Can you talk a little bit about the migration issue and how that's perceived at the moment?
Yes, I think it was a pretty good moment at the press conference to show what the difficulties are the German government is dealing with right now, because the popularity of the AfD is seen as having to do with immigration and being sort of a referendum on lowering the numbers, or at least that's a part of why it is so strong right now. And at the same time, Germany needs migration. We have a skilled labor problem, which is huge, according to most economists. And we have a shrinking population, or it is not shrinking because we have enough migration for now, but we need more. He put it in one phrase, which is actually pretty simple, but I think still hard to convey, that Germany wants to cut irregular migration, and it needs more regular migration, that is migration of skilled laborers to Germany. And it's actually quite simple, and you can see the coalition working on both. You can see them agreeing to the European compromise on migration and conversations with very difficult partners, if you want to call it like that, like Tunisia, to cut migration, to keep people in the countries they come from or they migrate through. And we've just seen before the summer break a bill passing the Bundestag that is supposed to facilitate skilled labor migration to Germany, which I think was a very important step. But I think it's hard to convey that to the general public, particularly with a party like the AfD saying we don't want any migration at all, pretty much.
Well, and so here's where one sees communication being, a critical issue, and this is something that's come up with the Chancellor before, where certainly people have felt that they haven't necessarily gotten that he has not gotten the messaging right. I mean, I think one could argue that with the heating legislation, it seems like one can argue that now in terms of some of the cases that are being made for migration. But even in other areas, when it comes to the support of Ukraine and elsewhere, where he's not been as forthcoming as I think some people might have hoped or expected. I mean, of course, talking about migration and about immigration and integration in German society, this is sort of a third rail topic for the Alternative for Germany, for the AfD, and we've seen some pretty striking numbers in recent weeks, but there's a new Ipsos poll that just came out with the AfD at 22%, which is 4 percentage points ahead of Scholz's Social Democrats. And of course, the Chancellor was asked about this at the press conference as well. He seemed, you said before that he seemed pretty level-headed and was trying to communicate to people not to stress out too much. And with regard to the AFD, he sort of indicated that he did not think that the AFD would be as much of a factor at the next election as it is right now. How is that received, and what's your sense of whether that's correct or not?
Well, I wish I knew, and of course I hope he's right. I think this is really, I don't know whether he truly believes that. He keeps saying it, and his people keep telling journalists that behind the scenes too. So that's clearly the message he wants out there. And it might be reasonable not to fret too much about it. I think, of course, it's difficult to say what contributes to the strength of the AFD, and migration is certainly one factor. Just protest against or a sense of uncertainty, a sense of discontent with this government is probably one factor too. And then we see the AFD the strongest in Eastern Germany, of course, where you have a lot of other issues coming into the equation, particularly the objection to Germany's policies in Ukraine, the delivery of weapons, a certain pro-Russian emotions, a different mix, I think, than in most of the Western German states. I think, I mean, we've seen the AFD going up and down in the past, so it's reasonable to hope that once circumstances change, their polls might change. And there was another very interesting poll, maybe indicating that it is possible this weekend, when people, or one institute asked people, including a party that doesn't even exist, which is the party that might be founded by Sarah Wagenknecht, one of the key figures in the left-wing Die Linke party, who has taken a very pro-Russian stance in the debate on the war in Ukraine. And if she were on the ballot and a list were on the ballot in Thuringia, which is one of the states where the AFD is particularly strong, it would very much eat away from the AFD. So it seems like some of that potential that the AFD is getting now could easily flow to other parties that are maybe less. She's critical on migration too, but in a different way. She's less nationalist. It's less. I think there is less ethnic resentment in what she says, but she's definitely pro-Russian. So that might go to other parties too. At the same time, we've also seen a poll that I found somewhat troubling, when one institute asked not just for, I mean, they usually ask what would you vote for next Sunday, but then people also ask, could you imagine voting for a certain party? And when you ask, would you vote for the AFD next Sunday, some 20% say I would, but the potential is even higher, and it's at the highest that it's ever been. So some 28% said in this poll, I can imagine voting for the AFD at some point in time. And I think that's interesting because, of course, in Germany, to every right-wing extremist party, there's large taboos attached for historic reasons. And we might see this as an indicator that this is somewhat lessening, that the taboo is somewhat gone, or gone for a larger portion of the population. But this is just one data point, so I really don't want to give a conclusive answer at this point in time. We'll see next year with 3 regional elections in the East.
Well, so let me pick up on that. I mean, obviously there are 2 elections this fall in the West, right? The Bavaria and Hessen are having elections. It will be interesting to see how the AFD does there. Obviously, the AFD is not polling at these high levels in the West. In the East, As you said, there are some areas where they're polling at 30%, and we'll see how that election goes. It is interesting to see that the conservative CDU is also very concerned as the AFD sort of closes in on it as well. And one of the questions that sort of come up over the last couple days here in Berlin with the group that I'm with is whether the high polling numbers are a reflection of the dissatisfaction that people have with the current coalition government, or whether it's really part of a larger trend. In the first scenario, people are polling and saying that they would support the AFD, but things would look different on election day, versus, of course, whether this is part of a larger trend. Do you have a sense of which sort of what we might be seeing playing out here?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to answer right now because the discontent was really great with the coalition in recent months. And I think both are possible. I think the discontent is a large portion of the high numbers we see now. And if they come back from recess and we get through the next winter, all right, and maybe even the war in Ukraine ends and some of the debates somewhat normalize, we might see a decrease in the numbers, particularly in Western Germany, which of course plays into the national results a lot more than the Eastern results. At the same time, the next year might have a normalizing effect, and it will throw Germany into quite a bit of trouble. And also the center and democratic parties, if the AfD comes in first in many of the Eastern states, we will have new discussions on how to build coalitions around them. It might probably be like we already have in one Eastern state, 3 or 4 party coalitions, which will then add more to the discontent with the existing system, because people feel, well, they are all the same. Look at how they can all work together. There's no difference between the Greens and the CDU. And yeah, it just will be a major political distortion. The system will look dysfunctional, and this might, have a reverberating effect. So I think it's really hard to say now what will happen in 2025 because there's so much happening in between now and then.
Sure. I mean, a lot can happen, and it will depend on a lot of different things. I mean, we're in sort of a unique period in German history at the moment with a 3-party coalition government in power, with 7 political parties represented in the Bundestag. I mean, I remember very well in the 80s and 90s when there were really just 3 parties in the Bundestag, and of course that has grown. So a lot can happen, and maybe picking up on that, you had mentioned Sarah Wagenknecht and this idea of a new party that is or would probably be a populist party, as you said, pro-Russian, critical of migration, perhaps less xenophobic than the alternative for Germany, but a party that would pull from the fringes, right, from the left, from Sarah Wagenknecht's current party, but also pull from the right, the extreme AfD. What do you think the likelihood is that party will actually form by the next election?
We've just discussed it this morning in here our planning round at DIE ZEIT, and I'm not an expert. I can only quote our expert. Certainly not before the end of the year, and I think there are some administrative difficulties. Also, Sarah Wagenknecht is not known as a really good organizer. She's a really good communicator, and she's a good face for the movement she wants to build. But she has financial trouble. She has trouble getting people to work with her. She would need some of her now party Die Linke to change sides, to join her new movement, and it's already a very this party is already diminutive in many in the Western states. It doesn't have any significance anymore. How would you do there? So I think it's still out in the open, but I think the likelihood that we will see another party on the ballot next year is still there. So yeah, I think she probably might. And of course, seeing the potential that came out in this survey will probably motivate many people to say, well, yeah, let's do this, let's try.
Yeah. So as we come to a close, you alluded to some of the infighting within the coalition government early in our conversation, but then you also said that the chancellor at the press conference was quite upbeat and sort of optimistic about the coalition's future. How stable do you think this government is, and do you think the Ampel, the traffic light, will hold?
Yes, I do. I mean, not because they love each other so much, but just because of the lack for alternatives. And I mean, if we don't have new elections, there is no other possibility right now to form a government. The Greens and the CDU wouldn't be enough. They will certainly not have a new grand coalition. And I think the way the CDU is currently refiguring itself makes it much harder for the Greens and the Liberals to join them, because they also, as an answer to the AfD, are becoming much more conservative when it comes to social questions such as LGBTQ rights and women's rights, gender language. So this is getting harder. So I think the outer circumstances will keep the Ampel together until the end.
Mm-hmm. I think having watched German politics, I think even though it's only July and people are already starting to talk about the halfway mark of this government, I'm sort of, wait a minute, that's 6 months from now, isn't it? But even as people start to look at the second half of this legislative period, it seems to me that we have at least another year or 18 months of the government really trying to demonstrate that it can hold together. Certainly in that year before the next election in 2025, all of the parties will need to be sort of developing their profiles and really trying to think about how they come across, because they'll be looking at that federal election as it comes up. So my assessment is similar to yours, right? This government has to hold because there's no other alternative at the moment. And I think if there were new elections, these parties are all very concerned that they would do worse than they did last time around. I'd be curious, to get your sense of whether that's part of the thought process as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about, or halfway through, is because the last 1.5 years feels like a full term, because we've seen so much, and also the government has already passed many of its major legislative projects, which are, it has raised the minimum wage, it has introduced a new Bürgergeld, which is the social security bill. It is one of the major promises that was also made by the Green parties, was raising the assistance for children of poor families. We are not quite there, but we will probably see that very soon after the summer break. We have all the major legislation concerning the Bundeswehr and defense expenditure, a new household, and many of the legislative projects are also for concerning, for example, the rights of rainbow families and LGBTQ people, something that the Liberals introduced. So they have really done a lot. They have brought us through a winter that could have been very cold, but wasn't. So I think as much as the infighting, I can understand it. It's frustrating to many voters to see that, but at the same time, they did get a lot of the stuff done they got elected for.
Well, Anna, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation in terms of covering some of the main foreign policy issues that people are thinking about here in Berlin, but really also trying to unpack some of the domestic issues. So herzlichen Dank. It's always great to talk with you. And I hope we'll have an opportunity again in the not too distant future.
Sehr gern. Enjoy Berlin.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.